Hey guys, this is Ken from Nippon Bro. How's it going? Hope you guys are having a great start to your week. And I just wanted to do a video on a question that's been asked towards me on DMs, as well as questions that I see constantly on Facebook, and just wanted to address it. And that is actually, what is the difference between RAW image and JPEG image, and which is better? So I kind of wanted to do this video explaining a little bit more in layman terms and more easier for you to understand and for beginners as well, and to be able to share it to those who are starting out in photography to be able to kind of learn a little bit more of the basics of photography in general. So having said that, I'll be right back after this brief intro. Welcome back, guys. I kind of just wanted to actually address this. I'm not sure if it's really an issue or not. Just a lot of people just having a lot of questions about shooting RAW or JPEG, or shoot both if your camera is capable of doing it. But I just kind of wanted to settle this once and for all for some people who are confused and that don't know really what to shoot in, if it's RAW or JPEG, or if they should be doing JPEG for professional client work. So I think what we need to do first is kind of go over the definition of RAW and JPEG and what are the pros and cons of each one. And after that, I'm going to do a visual presentation of JPEG and RAW, editing them in Lightroom, and for you guys to see what is the difference and what is the advantages of actually editing and shooting in RAW format. So first off, let's talk about JPEG. And JPEG is something that you see quite often if you are downloading an image from Google, or you take a photo on your phone and then you import it onto your computer. Most likely that file is going to be in JPEG. And the reason why JPEG is really popular is because of the file size being so small, as well as it being a already processed image that everyone can just take a photo and then post it on social media. This is why a lot of phone companies are just putting out JPEG content, because of the fact that no one really wants to mess with RAW content on a phone and then edit it and then post it. So a lot of people are just point and shoot and post it, and they want to make people's lives easier. So that's why JPEG is kind of more accessible to most people than others. So JPEG, in simple terms, is basically an image that is processed and completed within the camera. And I kind of just wanted to elaborate on that a little bit more so you guys understand what that actually means. Now, the question really becomes, how does a camera actually determine the color of the processed photo after you take a photo within the camera? And that actually bases off on two factors within the camera itself. Now, the first factor is white balance. And white balance is something that you can either set before you shoot, or you can shoot it on auto white balance and it'll choose for you. So white balance is basically the kind of the whole entire photo would either have a certain color temperature to it. So it would either be warm or cool or neutral, depending on what you would like to shoot. And so a lot of people actually leave this on auto white balance, which can be a mistake or it could be a blessing. It kind of is up to you, and photography again is subjective, so whatever you think is looking good is totally up to you. But if you want to have a little bit more flexibility and to be able to kind of play around with the settings, I would highly recommend you to do manual white balance and to choose any of the other settings and to at least learn what it does to your image. And I think this will better help you in terms of what it actually does and further make you understand what it does in post-processing. So I would shoot auto white balance first if you're not comfortable with your camera and you just want to go quickly outside and shoot different things. But I would highly recommend shooting maybe one particular shot with all the different types of white balance settings, just so you understand what each one does. Now, the second factor is the color science. Now, color science is just best known as the manufacturer or company or brand that actually makes the camera, and they're the ones who set these color science into place. So when you do take a JPEG photo and it's processed and then you take a look at it later, that is the color that you get from the actual manufacturer putting it into the camera. So you would oftentimes hear that Canon might have a little bit better skin tone effect and it's a little warmer, And then Sony is a little bit more magenta and a little bit cooler, more on the neutral side, I would say. So this is why a lot of people would prefer to use certain camera brands, just because of the color science that the camera manufacturer puts into the camera. And this isn't to really persuade you into getting certain types of brands so you get a certain type of look. This is more for just letting you know that camera companies are actually implementing these color sciences into the camera. So if you really think that shooting through a JPEG format and shooting a different type of photo is what you see is what you get through the screen, and your eyes are seeing the same thing, which is a little different. It's a little bit different of a perspective, because the actual image, the finished process of what you are shooting isn't what actually is seen with your eyes. It's what Sony or Canon or Panasonic or any other camera company is actually injecting into those photos to make those photos pop in their style. So it's not really what you're seeing with your eyes, it's actually what the camera company has done to those photos ahead of time when they manufacture these cameras. You are getting a finished process photo that is that brand or that company's style. And that is why a lot of people want to shoot RAW format in order to be able to manipulate those colors into their own style and not just Sony style or not just Canon style. So now this leads into the pros and cons of shooting JPEG. So one of the pros of shooting in JPEG is the fact that you get instant feedback. And the fact that you can actually click that shutter button and then watch your photo on your LCD screen after you take it, and that is kind of what you get. Whatever the color science that Sony or Canon or Panasonic have implemented onto their photos is what you get. Now, that isn't to say that you can't manipulate them, but because it's JPEG, just think of it as you have baked these data into the actual photo from the very start. And once it's baked, it's really hard to scrape off. The other pro is faster workflow, just so you can actually take a photo with your phone, with your camera, with any device that can take a JPEG photo, and then to be able to process that right away and post it onto social media if you do like the actual color science of the brand that you have chosen. And if you are doing client work, JPEG is one of the most common file formats to actually send to your clients. And you would probably never actually send your RAW photos because of the fact that you don't want them to manipulate the photos that you want to edit for your client. So you want to actually give them a JPEG format, which is already a edited RAW format, and then you just converted it into JPEG. So it's all caked and baked in, and then you're just ready to send that to your client. And then following that is JPEG format is actually smaller than RAW format. So your file sizes are smaller, and it's good to actually keep JPEG finished formats that you edited into a hard drive somewhere so you can keep it or upload it onto social media, and it's not going to take up too much space. So now moving on to the cons of shooting in JPEG format. And the first one that comes to mind is just the flexibility of editing photos and manipulating colors and highlights and shadows to be able to put it to your liking. You can edit JPEG photos no problem. When we mean editing photos, it just means manipulating the color and the highlights and the shadows, especially when they're blown out or they're very underexposed in the shadows. And that's what we mean by editing. But if you mean editing in terms of photoshopping and taking items out and putting new items in there, then you can totally do that whether it's RAW or JPEG. And that brings us on to our next point of cons, which is what you see is what you get. And this may be a con and maybe a pro for some people. Now it differs. So if you like what you see, and if you like the color science of the camera brand that you have, then it's going to be a pro for you. But if you don't, and you want to manipulate it, this is going to be a con. And then speaking of getting baked in, is the fact that whatever white balance that you choose or your camera chose because you left it in auto white balance, that is going to be your finished product. You cannot change the white balance after you have taken the photo and put it into post, because of the fact that the white balance affects the entire photo, and it's very, very hard to actually get that data back when you have baked it into a JPEG format. So the last con of shooting in JPEG format is the fact that the more you manipulate a photo, the more data you're losing and the more it can get out of hand. And that is just the fact with JPEG formats is since everything is baked in, you really cannot do too much editing. And when you do edit, it most likely is going to affect the entirety of the photo. And you can choose certain parts of the photo to change the luminancy value or the saturation. But this is more for when it comes to overexposing of the sky or underexposing of the foreground and vice versa. So this is kind of something that you really need to take into consideration is when it comes to manipulating photos, you might be able to change the color of certain things in the photo, even in a JPEG format. But when it comes to choosing what you want to expose for, whether it's the sky or the foreground, this is when you want a RAW format, because when you want to adjust the highlights and there is still data there, you just can't see it. It's only going to affect that area where it's blown out when you change the highlights in the photo. But when you do that for a JPEG, it's going to affect the entire photo of the highlights and not just where it pinpoints a blown out highlight is. So let's move on to RAW format files. And this is something that may be intimidating for most, but I hope to be able to kind of get you guys into shooting RAW formats and editing and trying to have fun with it, because it's, you know, when people think of Photoshop, they think of, you know, all these crazy things that people do with photos, with adding like astrophotography with planets and, you know, just insane things. And sure, that is one way of photoshopping, but when we talk about photoshopping in Lightroom, it's mostly to do with just bringing the life in the photo to tell a story, what you want people to focus on. And it's kind of the most natural way of photoshopping, I would say, than to manipulate it to a point where you took the photo and where you're taking different photos and you're layering them on top of each other and to create some type of different ultra reality. You know, that is art. That is art, and what we do as photographers and doing a kind of manipulating of colors and everything in our RAW format photos, that is also art. It's just a different accentuation of it. But enough of that, we're just gonna get straight into the pros and the cons of shooting in RAW format. So as kind of mentioned already, RAW format photos retains a lot of data, so you can actually go back and retain some of the highlights, retain some of the shadows, and bring it back up to life when you thought that it was all gone. And the great thing about RAW format files is you can give it to a friend or another photographer, creator, and they can totally make it look something completely different than what you have already done. So this is where RAW format is very awesome, is the fact that you can be so creative. You can take the same photo and just come back to a month later and you'll have something that's looking completely different. You know, you might not like it because you're like, well, I don't know how I edited the last one. And that's when you actually start creating presets. But I will do another episode on how to create presets. But this episode, I just wanted to talk more about RAW formats and how you can manipulate it, how you can have fun with it. So again, another pro is that of you can actually manipulate one photo many different ways and you can have so many different looks. And I think that is just awesome to have that kind of power in 2020, in actually the past kind of decade, to be able to do that. And now you can just, now it's kind of like you don't really think about it too much and you just do it. And it's become second nature to a lot of photographers. And then the last pro about shooting RAW is the fact that you can shoot in any white balance and that you can correct it even automatically in Lightroom. And I think that is awesome. So you can shoot in auto white balance, no problem, and just go start crazy shooting, and then when you get back home, you offload it onto your computer, put it onto Lightroom, and then just, you can even press auto white balance and Lightroom will just do it all for you, or you can just customize it. So that is all to do with the color temperature of the entire photo, and that is something that is really cool with shooting RAW photography. Now moving on to the cons of shooting RAW. Yes, there are some cons with shooting RAW, and you know, you might like it, you might not like it, but I don't think it's too big of a deal. But there is some learning curves to actually shooting in RAW format and editing. So the first con of actually shooting RAW is the fact that you need to take a little bit more time in editing. And the fact that you might take the first photo that you might start doing might frustrate you, might actually take you a very, very long time. The first photo that I've ever edited, I think I took about 20 minutes. And that's me actually learning each thing of what everything does, what each slider does, what exposure does, highlights, shadows, tone curves, HSL, and even using the masking tools and everything. About 20 minutes for one photo that took me, but I learned a lot. And now, come to editing, I can do it within a minute or two, and I don't spend more than 2 minutes editing a photo unless I want to do some crazy Photoshop, which I will then export into Photoshop and I'll do some crazy stuff. And that may take me anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. It really depends on the project, really. So that leads me into another con, is the fact that you don't really get the instant feedback as you do JPEG in camera. And some cameras that I've seen, when you shoot RAW, it does sometimes give you a preview of what it would look like if you did shoot in JPEG. But when you do upload it into your computer, into Lightroom, then it becomes a little washed out. And the washed out feature is kind of their way of making kind of a clean slate for you to edit. And that's what it is. And from there, you're just going to edit your photo from a blank slate and create something new out of it. But because of the fact that RAW format files hold a lot of data, the other con to this is actually the file being very, very large compared to JPEG format. So it might take up a lot of space in your computer or your SSD externally. But I would say have a lot of SSDs or hard drives to be able to keep your photos and house them somewhere else other than your computer, so your computer doesn't slow down ultimately in the end. And the last con I have for you for shooting RAW is the fact that it may slow down your computer if you don't have a fast enough computer to process RAW files when you're editing on Lightroom or any other program. And that is something that a lot of people have faced, and I've seen that in Facebook groups and DMs of people DMing me, and it is something that is unfortunate because of the fact that you want to edit these photos, and that's why some people just kind of leave it at JPEG and stick with JPEG, is because they don't have a computer to process this. And eventually you might upgrade your computer, and a lot of people would have to, just because of how technology is and how megapixels are getting more in cameras, and also the fact of editing softwares are getting more technologically advanced. So you are going to need a better computer in the very end, but it shouldn't stop you from just tinkering with RAW formats and at least trying it out. You don't have to do it for all your photos, and especially if you're doing social media, you don't have to do it for everything, but I would at least try to learn it, so when you do upgrade in the future, you are ready for it. You're ready to actually manipulate photos and to create bangers for Instagram and other social media platforms. Okay, so now that we have actually gone through everything in terms of, the pros and cons of RAW and JPEG and what RAW and JPEG are in kind of layman terms, and hopefully you guys understood that part. Now we're going to go onto my computer, and we're just going to take a look at some of the photos that I've kind of made in a certain way, so I can show you an example of what you can do with JPEG and what you can't do, and what you can do with RAW. So we're going to get into the computer, but also I do have another video of me editing Lightroom photos. I'll leave the actual link somewhere up here and in the description as well if you guys want to go check that out. But otherwise, let's get into it, and I'll show you a couple examples of RAW versus JPEG. Alright guys, so I actually have these photos side by side, and you guys can kind of see what's going on here. And in Lightroom, you can do this by going to RNA here, and one's going to be a reference photo and one's going to be an active. When you choose a reference photo, you can choose any photo that you want to kind of reference from. So what you can do is just simply click on the photo and drag it into place. And then the other one, for the active one, which you are going to be working on, you can just click and drag into place as well. So once you have done that, you're going to have two photos side by side. And I'm actually going to first start off with JPEG. So the JPEG here is on the right, and then we got the RAW format on the left. Now both of these photos are overexposed on the sky, and just kind of trying to expose for the foreground mostly. But now, like I said, there is a con with JPEG into manipulating the highlights and shadows. So I'm going to show you that right now in terms of how that works. I'm going to actually just click on to auto white balance just to show you guys what the actual software thinks what an automatic white balance and perfectly exposed photo looks like for an overexposed sky like this, and trying to get that back. And Lightroom's going to actually try really hard to do that. So let's go ahead and click on that. Now, as you can see right here, you can see the photo actually kind of have a little bit more of a warmer tone, and it brought a little bit of life into the sky compared to before. So let me just toggle this back and forth so you guys can see. So brightly overexposed sky, and now you have a little bit more of a toned down sky, and you can kind of see a little bit of the blue sky in the back there, and a little bit more contrast in the clouds itself. So now you guys kind of know what Lightroom will do to a JPEG file when it's trying to auto white balance it. But don't take this as a kind of a permanent thing that everyone says about JPEG, and they're like, you know, you can't edit JPEG and all that kind of stuff. You know, to a certain point you can't, but you still can. So I wouldn't say it's, you know, it's not 110% that you cannot edit JPEG. You still can, and obviously this kind of proves it. So going back here, you are going to just, maybe if you want to leave it at this, then totally fine. If you're subjective to this type of style, then I totally wouldn't, you know, judge you for that at all. But I just wanted to show you guys a little bit more on what happens if I do auto white balance onto a RAW file, which is the one next to it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this photo of JPEG, and I'm just going to reference it to the left hand side. We're just going to keep that. And then I'm going to take the RAW format file, which is still overexposed in the sky, and then I'm going to actually apply a auto white balance and auto exposure onto this photo, and we're going to see what Lightroom does to this photo. Now you can see a little bit more mood. We have a little bit more detail in the sky, and to be able to get this type of detail in the sky with a JPEG photo is almost impossible. And that's only because it's almost impossible to obtain this type of detail without having to actually reflect it back onto the foreground, which we want to keep in this instant. So let's actually reference this RAW file back to the left. So we have this as a reference, and we're going to go back with the JPEG file that we've just kind of did the auto white balance. And to be able to kind of get this type of detail, most likely a lot of people are just going to go with clarity, and they're going to boost the clarity, and then they're going to boost the dehaze. And you can kind of get the similar type of detail, but what's going to end up happening is you're going to actually start to get a little bit more of a lesser detail photo, and it's going to look a little bit more unprofessional, and you can just kind of zoom in and see. But again, if you don't care if people zoom into your photo, or you think, oh, maybe, you know, a lot of people are not going to zoom into my photo on Instagram, who cares? Of course, then go ahead with editing JPEG like this, and you can get almost a similar look, but you're just going to get a little bit more of a harsher, more processed look. Now, if that's the look that you're going for, again, no problem. Go ahead. And I think photography is totally subjective. So if you think it's good, then all power to you. And, you know, I think that is great. At least you found something you're confident with, and you can kind of go with it and run away with it. And you're going to find the market, and you're going to find the fans that love your work. Now I'm going to actually move on to a different photo here so I can show you guys more of a blown out highlight. And I kind of did this just so I can show you guys more of an example of what you can and cannot do with JPEG. So what I'm actually going to do is I have a JPEG photo here which is perfectly exposed, and then I have another JPEG photo here that is overexposed. So now you're going to see a little bit of a manipulation that I'm going to do with the overexposed photo to make it look similar to the perfectly exposed JPEG file on the left. So what we're going to do is, right now off the bat, you are going to notice that it's really overexposed. So let's change the exposure. Then this is what a lot of people are going to do. Now, changing the exposure is going to do one thing when you bring it down, is the fact that you are going to see this kind of like gray haze come down on the entire photo. And that's because exposure, when you're doing the edit, is just entirely taking the exposure off of the surface of the photo and not actually pinpointing where the actual highlight is. Now you might say, okay, well, if you're trying to do the highlights, well, why don't you just go to highlights and just take out the highlights? Now you can see from 0 to here, you can see a little bit happening, but not much. And it's still giving you a little bit of that kind of, I don't know what it looks like. It's kind of like a hazed look. And it doesn't have too much contrast or punch to it. And we can fix that, no problem. But let's just say we drop the highlights all the way down and then we drop the exposure all the way down. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to actually get this keypad line a little bit more defined in this photo here. And you can kind of see automatically right now, you don't have the drop shadow that's happening on this line on here, and actually it's almost like disappearing. And this is all the data that we have lost by shooting JPEG and overexposing it, of course. And to get that detail back is extremely, extremely hard. Even if you boost the contrast all the way up and then started adding a bit more shadow, it is almost impossible to get that back. I'm just doing everything, but look what's happening to the photo. I mean, you can see the keypad's changing, it's turning more black, but you don't see this line appearing more or less. It's just staying relatively the same. And that's the issue with shooting in JPEG mode, is the fact that you cannot retain this data back because of the fact that it's already baked in there. And this is what you get when it comes to shooting these type of photos in JPEG mode. So let's actually go into something that is a little bit more extreme on the other side of the spectrum, which is underexposing a photo and having too much shadows. So I'm gonna actually put this on the right hand side so I can edit it. And then again, you have the perfectly exposed photo on the left. So what I'm actually going to try to do is try to bring it to the same level, and then we're going to see what is the actual difference when I do edit with the JPEG format. What I'm actually going to do is start boosting the exposure. So I'm going to expose it to the point where it has similar highlights on the actual laptop on the right bottom here. So let's just make it so you see, I would say just about there. Yeah, that's about the same. And then now this part is dark on here, and I want to bring it up. So let's take out the blacks a bit. Actually, I'm going to take out the blacks to the maximum, and then I'm going to take out the shadows, and then that should kind of do it. Now this one's a little bit more contrasty, so you can obviously add in the contrast. And that's going to bring down the shadows a bit more, so I'm going to, take those out a little bit. And then this is pretty much as good as you're going to get. I mean, let's take down the highlights just a bit there. All right, so these two photos are relatively looking similar. And obviously they're not completely similar because of the fact that you can see on the back here, you can see more of the lines here, and in this one you cannot. It's a bit more blurred out. There's a bit more depth of field going on, but this one is getting a bit more detail in the back. Again, this might be something that you're looking for, but everything else seems to be pretty even. Now, let's see the actual difference of what's going on here. We're gonna actually zoom into the photo here, and we're gonna focus on the black keyboards. Now, what you're gonna actually see here is you're gonna actually see a little bit more detail, and you might think that this is a little bit more detail happening here, but this is actually noise that's starting to get introduced into the photo. And if you want to, let's say, brighten this up a bit more so you can kind of get a little bit more light into the photo, and you're gonna actually start to see a little bit more of these noise that's happening in the keyboard here. And the one in this one is perfectly smooth. So that's kind of the issue with underexposed photos, is that you're not going to be able to expose it all the way and then not have any noise come back. You're going to have a little bit of noise, but again, if you are okay with this and you are okay to post that on social media because it compresses the file anyways, you might be okay with that. But having said that, if it does compress an already kind of degraded JPEG file, the quality is going to get worse when you post it into social media. So another reason why we actually edit in RAW is because we're not actually degrading the quality at all. We're just manipulating what data is already there, and then we are exporting in the highest quality possible. And then when social media kind of degrades it, it's still going to be very, very good quality. So hopefully you guys learned a little bit more on JPEG and RAW format and which style that you guys might want to choose, or you guys might want to try out RAW and be less intimidated hopefully after this video, and just at least try it. And while you're quarantined and while you're staying at home and doing social distancing, I highly recommend you to at least try to manipulate RAW formats, and it's not that intimidating. And once you've manipulated certain photos a certain way, then you can create presets for it. Like I said, I'm going to create a different video for that, but this is when you can start creating your own presets and to be able to have them. So when you do take a certain style of photography at different times of day, different types of sunlight, then you can apply that preset onto your photo and start editing from there. Then your workflow would just become that much quicker. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I think it became a little bit longer than anticipated, but hopefully you guys got a lot of value out of this. And if you did, please smash the like button and turn on those notifications for future videos like this. And if you guys have any other questions based on RAW format or JPEG format, please comment down below. And otherwise, if you are new to this channel, please subscribe. And I see that a lot of you are watching this are not subscribed, so please, to be able to support this channel and the company of Nippon Bro Productions, I would highly appreciate if you do give it a subscribe. And also, I do have a podcast that is actually a weekly episode, which is called Tune In and Chill. You can actually search that on any of your preferred podcast app that you listen to, whether it's Apple, Spotify, Google, and many, many more. And also there is a GoFundMe link to my project that I have right now that's going on to help other creators around the world, to be able to give them a chance to showcase their work, to be able to get clients, to be able to make a living off of creating. So that is also linked down in the description below. But that is going to be it for me, guys, and I'm not sure if I'm going to do another video this week, and if you do turn on those notifications, you'll be notified when I do post a new video. So with that having said, I will see you guys in the next one, and take it easy. Peace.